want to talk about the term paper, because your term paper is due 3 weeks from this Friday. So 3 weeks from this Friday. All right. So remember, it's a 1,500 to 2,000 word APA format term paper, and you're looking for 4 sources. So what's the term paper about? Well, we kind of already talked about it. It's a relatively straightforward term paper in that sense. You are taking one of the philosophers from the textbook that we do not cover in class. And we only cover 10 in class, so there's a hell of a lot more than 10 in there. And so any philosopher that is covered in that textbook is fair game, as long as they aren't covered in class. So any one of them, even Nietzsche, Elvis. So any of them are fair game. You can, your job, your mission for the paper is to read the philosopher, understand the philosopher as best you can. So obviously the textbook sources are going to help in terms of that. And obviously, to a certain extent, your sources are going to be primary sources in terms of understanding the philosopher. So, however, once you understand the philosopher, then your paper is going to be, your essay is going to be demonstrating that you kind of can critically think through the philosopher's ideas and his arguments by trying to apply them to a contemporary social or political issue, or tension, or conflict. What would the philosopher kind of think? What would they argue? If you understand their philosophy, then you should be able to use that understanding of your philosophy to kind of to make a proxy argument for the philosopher about how we should resolve this issue, or how they might argue we should resolve this issue. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, it seems to make sense to Nathaniel, but since this class, I can clearly see
I was
that
muted.
there's more
Yes.
people. Okay. So it made sense to Charlene, Justin, Robert, Elvis?
Hello.
Oh, I can hear you, Elvis.
I'm a little late. Sorry.
I can barely hear you, Elvis.
Oh, you can't hear me?
It's barely. I can hear Charlene and I can hear Nathaniel fine, but you're kind of soft. So it might be the volume on your mic or the distance away your mic is from your mouth.
What about right now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
So what did you say?
I didn't say anything. I just said hello.
Okay. So we're talking about the term paper and what you're supposed to be doing with the term paper. So just to move forward with that, I definitely highly recommend that since next week is spring break and they didn't listen to me and cancel your spring break to make up for the week you had off when we were transitioning to online, which I thought we should have done, but they're like, no, we can't cancel spring break. Spring break is such an important and, virtuous institution designed for the common good that we can't deny our students the ability to go and get strung out on illicit substances for a week in order to, kind of obliterate their memory and their existential despair in this kind of indulgence in self-destruction. So you guys have spring break. Yes, Robert. You actually can use physical volumes if you have them. So And I know you do. I know you have lots of physical volumes of different things. But obviously, to a certain extent, it's easier to, you can't exactly go out to the library, but you can, if you just so desire, find something that you would like to read or a source and order it or purchase it on Amazon, for instance. So you can use physical volumes. You cannot kind of check things out from our library right now, unfortunately. So, but there is the Saragossa Library has a lot of electronic versions of many of these books, and so you can use those. You can use the library databases for sure, and in many cases you're going to be able to find things about these philosophers as a kind of open sources online in many cases. So you certainly can, or the Ridgecrest Library either. You can't use either of those, and that is unfortunate, to be sure. However, for this paper, you guys are in a little bit of a better situation because you have sources right in the textbook that you can be using, so that you already have. Obviously, there's going to be things covered in the textbook that the author's works are going to be highlighted in the textbook. Some authors, there's only one work of theirs. Other authors, there's multiple works. So the other thing is that you can use the introduction to these authors. So like the introduction to Locke is written by a political philosophy scholar, a scholar of Locke themselves. So that counts as an academic work. And in every article written for these philosophers in this textbook is a peer-reviewed article. So that counts as an academic source. So just in that textbook, you have the primary sources of the philosophers' arguments themselves, and you have a secondary source that counts. So you have two sources right there. Given that, yes, it's going to be helpful to get more of the philosophers' works, primary sources, so you're not just limited to what they edit into this book. But even so, you still have those sources. That means the other sources you're primarily going to want to find are going to be the sources on the current issue, the current kind of modern political or social issue, tension, or controversy and conflict that you want the philosopher's philosophy and arguments you want to bring to bear on a kind of a contemporary issue. So you guys are in a kind of a better position than some other people who don't have access to the Ridgecrest or to the Saragossa Library and have to find 4 completely new sources. Did you say something, Elijah? I couldn't hear it. No? Okay. You popped up on my screen as having said something, so I was asking. But all right. By the end of next week, by the end of spring break, what I am encouraging you to do is to have your philosopher selected and to have the issue you want them to talk about or want to bring their argument and philosophy to bear upon selected. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that gives you this weekend and all of next week to essentially go through the textbook, read some of the introductions, or at the very, kind of read some of the sections themselves, or even just Wikipedia some of the philosophers in the textbook to see what Wikipedia gives you, just an overview, and then you can dive into the introduction to the philosopher. All the introductions are, they range between 600 to 1,500 to 2,000 words, so they're not very long. And you can read those introductions to a particular set, of philosophers and see which one challenges you, or that you relate to the argument, or for sometimes it's just a philosopher that you can like wrap your mind around their argument more easily. And then you don't have to necessarily agree with them. As a matter of fact, I doubt you will fully agree with many of these philosophers, and I hope you don't. I recommend that you write upon a philosopher who you don't just naturally agree with. Because if you do, then you might end up just like writing a paper that's kind of a fanboy or a fangirl or a cheerleader kind of essay, where you're kind of like, they were so brilliant and they just said this and this is the perfect way to do this. The end. It's like, that's boring. Don't make my life boring. Give me something there. Give me a little bit more than that. So in that sense, finding a philosopher is going to be a significant part of this exercise. And then finding an issue, a modern day issue that you could look at. So there's going to have to be some research done over this weekend and over the next week to really make sure to help you get into, or you're exactly right, yes. To help you kind of set yourself a good foundation of a good philosopher that you can wrap your mind around, that you can understand, and an issue that will be a good foil for applying their philosophy. All right? I am just going to be spending this weekend and all of next week, because I'm not going to have any classes to teach, mostly sitting on my porch in nice weather, drinking wine or whiskey and having a cigar and shortening my life by several weeks or maybe even a year or two, but delightfully doing so. So I will certainly have time to answer your questions or to answer your emails or even to have video conferences with you to help you work through this process. Does that make sense? And of course that makes sense. It's plain language. But so please take advantage of that. Like, if you want, we can absolutely have a conference, a Zoom conference, a set-up Zoom conference. We can set it up on the spot, and we can talk, or we can simply just have a conversation about what philosopher you're thinking about and what issue, and I could give you some advice, including advice that says, wow, that's really ambitious. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Or, I don't think that philosopher is going that direction on that issue. I had one of my favorite and best students in the past, Alex Tellez, who went to Berkeley despite my best efforts to dissuade him from going to that nuclear waste dump of a toxic school. But he went anyways, and now he's actually he's working for Teach for America, and he got his he applied and works for Teach for America. He's a very bright kid, and when he took my class, he chose Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, and he was trying to claim and argue in his paper that Burke would be pro-gay marriage and like in favor of changing societal norms and legal norms to accept gay marriage. And he was a bright kid, but he was kind of falling into this trap of thinking that Burke was so intelligent that he must be on my side on this particular controversy and issue. And so we had to work through it, and I had to help him understand, why his understanding of Burke was a little bit narrow, and that it's absolutely fine to talk about Burke and what Burke would say about gay marriage, or kind of same-sex marriage. But you don't have to agree with Burke to write the essay. You could say, Burke is going to argue this, but this is what Burke misses when he takes this position. So there's lots of different ways you can go with this, but I would highly recommend that you kind of bounce your ideas, both in terms of your philosopher and in terms of your issue, off of me sometime during next week.
Are you going to put a written prompt on Canvas, or I couldn't find one on the syllabus.
Well, let me take a look. And by the way, Robert, yes, some people like Henry Olson have tried to make the Burkean conservative argument for same-sex marriage. However, that argument has, as kind of intellectually stimulating as it is, really doesn't, it really falls to critique over time. So, but you're right, absolutely. And Henry Olson, who was George W. Bush's Solicitor General and whose wife died in the plane that hit the Pentagon during 9/11, is the primary kind of proponent of the conservatives' case for same-sex marriage. And it's not an invalid argument, to be sure. It's actually an engaging argument. Charles Murray as well, but you know, obviously Henry Olson's the one who was actually arguing the case before state Supreme Courts and federal courts. So
isn't his first name Theodore? Ted Olson, right?
Ted Olson. Ted Olson, sorry, yeah. Not Henry Olson. That's me mixing up names again. You're right, it's Ted Olson's. Anyways, let me go to Elvis's kind of point here. You're right, Elvis. Okay.
You could just email us, or I mean, never mind. It doesn't even matter.
No, it's fine. I wrote out a prompt for this paper for the syllabus. Did I use the wrong syllabus? And there's very possible. I probably created a new syllabus with the written prompt on it. And then as I was transferring things between the syllabuses to create the syllabus for this semester, I probably ended up altering the dates on the old syllabus instead of the new syllabus and then posting it. That definitely sounds like an absent-minded thing I would do. So I will, yes, tomorrow I will work on getting the prompt onto the syllabus and posting the new syllabus on there so you have the written prompt on it. Fair enough?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions about this? No? Okay. Then let's wrap up Hobbes and move into Locke. All right, so I'm just going to kind of summarize Hobbes a little bit and kind of bring us back to Hobbes. I mean, Hobbes, what I love about Hobbes is his consistent ability to piss off students. And I mean piss them off. Honestly, when I was a graduate student at USC, TAing for the political science honors class, I was the teaching assistant for it. Hobbes would piss people off, and at USC, he pissed people off when we studied him at my own undergraduate, Gordon College, and he pisses people off here. Hobbes has a tendency to piss students off. And I find it hilarious because he doesn't anger me at all. I believe he's flawed. His argument is flawed in many ways, but it doesn't exactly piss me off. But I really appreciate that he does piss students off. At least you're engaged. So, but remember that Hobbes is pretty much the first, prominent social contract philosopher. And so, despite however much he might, piss you off, he is very important in the sense that he's the first one to say that government
Matt Jones.
Hmm?
Do you think that he pisses people off so much because Locke's ideas are so absorbed into the cultural consensus by now. Like, that's kind of what I realized when I was, looking through Locke. It's like, man, all this stuff I believed, it's, I believed it before I heard it really articulated. You know what I mean?
You were a Lockean before you knew you were a Lockean. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I think most people are at least somewhat Lockean before they knew they were. Most people in America. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. So, well, maybe to a certain extent, right. America is obviously its Declaration of Independence and some of its core spirit is derived from Lockean principles, or at least, we say Lockean principles, but they were kind of in the ether and emanating throughout Anglo society, and Locke just kind of gives a very prominent voice to them. But yeah, I think so. I think the other reason why he pisses students off is because of this concept of the Leviathan, and especially modern day students are very sensitive to like abuse of power or tyrannical power. I mean, Americans overall, we're a nation that was born like hypersensitive to the abuse of power through hierarchy. Hence, having an incredibly bloody revolution because of taxes. So that's oh, absolutely. Locke had a much stronger influence on the revolution and the framers of the Constitution and revolutionary argument than Locke does. But really, kind of Locke is an evolution of Hobbes. I mean, we're going to see the relationship between them. Hobbes and Locke are both social contract philosophers and state of nature philosophers. I mean, obviously those two things go hand in hand. But really, Hobbes is the one who's going to kind of be the innovator in terms of this idea of consent of the governed. Students get angry, like, what's this Leviathan? What's this kind of autocrat who can just do what he says and dictate what he wants? And Hobbes also seems to be a monarchist. He seems to be arguing for this kind of absolute monarchy, and Americans by nature tend to be rejected and kind of be disgusted by the concept of absolute monarchy. But really, that's a very narrow reading of Hobbes, who, again, says that that the Leviathan can be a monarchy, it can be a republic, it can be kind of a democracy for all, He just doesn't, he believes that the monarchy is probably going to be the more stable way of doing things. But in the end, we have to understand that the basic Lockean principle is that in the state of nature, not the basic Hobbesian principle, sorry, in the state of nature is that all that men are individuals, or I should say free individuals, but in that state of nature, they are not only free individuals, but they are free individuals in constant fear of the power of other free individuals. Remember, in the state of nature, every man is a law unto himself. This is going to lead to anarchy, war, and essentially a nasty, brutish, and short life. Essentially, what he's saying is that without a rule enforcer, without a sovereign who is strong enough without a sovereign who is strong enough to be feared, then we are going to fear other men, that we can't bring order. A sovereign who is strong enough to be feared is strong enough to bring order, certainty, and stability. To him, the key thing here is that Hobbes believes human nature is power-seeking and selfish. Power-seeking and selfish. He doesn't really trust humans at their word. He doesn't trust human reason. He doesn't trust human virtue. He believes that it's power-seeking and selfish, and that the only thing stronger, let me say this clearly, the only thing stronger than human selfish power-seeking is our fear of other human selfish power-seeking. The only thing as influential upon our actions as our own desire for power, to have selfish power over others, is our fear that others will have selfish power over us.
Question?
Go ahead.
I can't. Is this specifically just about Hobbes now, or is this whole thing you wrote about all social contract philosophers?
Okay, so all social contract philosophers say government gains legitimacy only through consent of the governed, and that in the state of nature we are free individuals. However, Hobbes is the first one, and we're summing up Hobbes's social contract state of nature theory, so we can then say how Locke is different.
Okay.
We're comparing and contrasting.
All right.
Right. Charles I did meet a nasty and kind of brutish end. And obviously, to a certain extent, what Hobbes is kind of arguing here, or let me put it this way. We can interpret Hobbes' purpose to a certain extent in the Leviathan as saying that people should be careful about so easily disposing of a sovereign. Because when you dispose of a sovereign, generally you move closer to the state of nature. And he sees the English Civil War as, in part, moving that direction. That you shouldn't be so lustful for freedom, so lustful for your individual freedom, that you forget that without a stable sovereign, everybody else also is lustful for freedom, and they will be seeking power over you. So, what is better? Being in a state where every man is a law unto himself, constantly in competition and seeking power over each other, or being under a social contract in which every man gives up every right that he wants to exercise over other men, so that those men will also give up every right they want to exercise over me. That's the core element of the social contract. And that is true both in Hobbes' version of the social contract and Locke's version of the social contract. The basic fundamental idea of the social contract is that we move from the natural state to the civil state. We move from the natural state to the civil state. Through the social contract, we move from the natural to the civil by a social contract, a contract between that gains the consent of the governed. And we sign this contract because it's in our own best interest. That's also true with Locke and with Hobbes. We sign this contract, and obviously we don't sign the contract. It's not like, we're walking around 300 million people signing the contract. But we consent to the contract. Let me put it that way. We consent to this contract because it's in our own best interest. Hobbes is trying to convince people why it's in their own best interest to consent to the contract. He's saying, you guys might have forgotten, but it's in your own best interest to consent to this contract, because in this contract, yes, you lose your rights. You lose your rights of power over other people. But what you gain is far better. Because what you gain is you gain the security of knowing they've lost their rights over you. They've lost their rights over you.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go for it, Elijah.
Okay, so when I was reading Hobbes, one of the things that I saw specifically was that essentially everybody conceives of a social contract, but you're only essentially, Leviathan doesn't have direct control over you in a lot of ways. In most ways, you are just the author of his laws and his domain. So in that sense, you are an individual. You have control over your own life, your own self. So therefore, you can't complain that anybody has power over you. Because that's like saying, oh, you have no control over yourself? That's impossible.
Okay, Elijah brings up a very, very good point, which is we have to remember so let me put it this way. I think one of the reasons Hobbes pisses off people in post-World War II, kind of Western societies and American society more, is because technology has allowed for the possibility of totalitarian states. But in Hobbes's day, technology did not allow the presence of the state to be so powerful and profound. Even a tyrannical, monarchical king could not be totalitarian. He didn't have the scope and reach of power to invade people's lives on anything close to the scope that the state has today. So even a Leviathan or a king with kind of absolute sovereignty was not going to affect your life in the way that it's capable of affecting your life today. Kings just did not have the resources. They didn't have the technology, the resources, the manpower to do so, especially for most peasants, who most people ignored and kept their heads down. So, like, the scope of abuse of power that is possible starting in the 20th century is not the same as the scope of power in the 17th century. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And perhaps that's what modern students are kind of like, well, holy crap, like, what are you asking for? So, but Hobbes is not going to conceive of the sovereign's ability to kind of exercise that kind of power. It was not conceivable at that time. We didn't have an industrial state. We didn't have a technologically kind of advanced and intrusive state like we do today.
Maybe that's why it's so scary to us, because we imagine it and then the word Leviathan, like you imagine a big brother. You imagine 1984 by George Orwell. That's what you imagine.
Right. But of course, Hobbes wasn't imagining 1984, because 1984 was 1984. He's living in 1684. And he's writing this in 1651. So, we're talking 200 years earlier. 1984 is only possible because of the modern state and the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's take Robert's comment because it's a good comment. Hobbes fears civil war more than any other kind of conflict. That's absolutely true. He fears disorder. But the one he fled occurred in a highly organized state with a strong sovereign. That's the part where I would say perhaps not, because as the English Civil War is going on, Charles I is being beheaded at the same time that Louis XIII and Louis XIV are creating absolute monarchy in France. So, it's definitely, compared to the French and the Prussian sovereigns, the English sovereign, by the time of the English Civil War, is actually not that strong. I mean, yes, stronger than what we would consider to be a sovereign, but the Magna Carta had already, and the traditions of the Magna Carta and the evolution of the Magna Carta's principles had already kind of hamstrung the state, or the monarchy. The parliament was definitely feeling its oats for over half a century before Charles I was beheaded. The Leviathan failed to protect its citizens from violence worse than any in a state of nature. Okay, good. So, and this is something where Hobbes is going to be clear. The legitimacy of the Leviathan, the legitimacy of the sovereign is only legitimate to the extent that they can enforce order, certainty, and stability. If the sovereign cannot coerce order, certainty, and stability, they lose their legitimacy. Does that make sense? Now, this kind of creates a tautology, but in the sense that a sovereign is legitimate as long as they can maintain their sovereignty. So for instance, if a rebellion works, then the sovereign isn't legitimate, but that's a tautology. So, essentially, if the rebellion works, then the sovereign wasn't strong enough. But that's still the idea, is that we consent to the social contract and give up all of our rights over other people to the sovereign, so that one person or the sovereign, even if it's a republic or a democracy, still, so the government, we'll just put it that way, the government or the state. So the government or the state has essentially sovereign authority to enforce common, and that's the core part, common rules that all must follow. This is in, according to Hobbes, the individual's best interest to do. Because now you have one set of rules that everybody follows. They're clear, and they're stable, and if the sovereign's doing his job, they're enforced. And other people will follow those rules as well, as long as the sovereign's doing his job and has the power to enforce those rules. This is far better than being in a situation in which every man is making his own rules. This is why Hobbes calls it a commonwealth, because there's common rules. And this is social contract philosophers, both Hobbes and Locke, generally refer to the regime or the social order that comes out of a social contract as a commonwealth. Does this make sense? Does this kind of round out or flesh out Hobbes a little bit more and kind of create a little bit of a better understanding of him than just a simplistic understanding as a justifier of tyranny?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, to a certain extent, you can have a social contract framework and a state of nature, a hypothetical state of nature rational justification or argument, and it not be Hobbesian. Hobbes, really, the reason why Hobbes' argument hangs together is because Hobbes really prioritizes fear. I mean, that's why in the introduction to Hobbes, it starts out with Hobbes' kind of, claim that he had a twin brother. When his mother gave birth, she gave birth to twins, Hobbes and fear, is that his life was organized around fear. And so to him, fear is the prioritized motivation of human beings. And so his entire philosophy hinges on the efficacy and the power of fear over human minds, human wills, and human actions. Hence, we need a sovereign strong enough to be feared. And the sovereign's primary duty is to maintain that fear so that he can establish a common set of rules that all must follow. Okay, good. Robert says, but rules always favor some members of the Commonwealth over others. So those left out will not see those rules as legitimate and will seek to change the rules. Hence, conflict is unavoidable. Hobbes would absolutely agree with you. Hobbes would say, yes, Robert, you are my friend. We are brothers. Let's go to a Paris cafe and debate politics wearing berets. So that's what Hobbes would say. He'd say, yes, absolutely, conflict is unavoidable. Because what some people see as the common good, other people will see as being left out, as alienating. Because remember, we all define good and just, and we all define common in different ways. So you can't trust two men's reason because we define terms and we define ideas and we define adjectives differently. What you call good, I call bad. What you call beautiful, I call ugly. What you call necessary, I call tyranny. And we even see that now. There's a massive raging debate over whether the shutdown of the economy and this quarantine is necessary or whether it is intrusive, it is unnecessary and unjust or violation. And the longer it goes on, the more people are going to experience it one way or the other. And Hobbes understands that. And he says, so we can't trust to common understandings of what good is bad. Conflict is unavoidable. That's why there has to be a sovereign who's strong enough to force the people who say, this is bad, I don't like it, to join in and follow the rules anyways.
I mean, but I think his point is that in his quest to free people from uncertainty and fear, all he does is redirect uncertainty and fear to the sovereign. Like, I don't understand how that's any better.
Well, because it creates certainty.
Well, if you say, yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough.
I think now there's only one person who can do violence against you instead of everybody around you.
Yeah, that's
right.
True.
That's a hell of a lot more certainty than you had before.
That's true. That's true. Give you that.
Now, there's a counter that I'm kind of neglecting right now to try, because I'm being Hobbes' champion, because my career has taught me that he pisses students off and I need to step in between students and Hobbes or they'll lynch him. So, but there is a counter, which obviously is if the sovereign has absolute power, then the sovereign can essentially, can create his own uncertainty by making one rule one day and another rule the next day. Like, what if the sovereign is inconsistent? So, or what if he's doing everything selfishly? Well, and Hobbes is kind of saying, of course he's doing everything selfishly, or of course he's going to be motivated by self-interest. All human beings are. But we are still in a better state with with a sovereign that is capable of enforcing his self-interested rules on everybody else, because at least there's common rules. Now, that still opens him up to the charge of what if the sovereign is inconsistent and changes the law day by day by day, and it's hard to keep up. Well, in that case, there's an argument that says that the sovereign would then be putting himself in an unstable position and losing kind of his authority. Because let's round out Hobbes, or let's kind of wrap up Hobbes and then move on to transition to Locke in this way. Is it possible for any man to be feared enough all on his own to enforce a common set of rules on society?
Maybe not. No. He needs an
No.
army.
Huh?
So maybe he needs an army or something.
Yeah, in other words, there's no like Thor or Superman. There's no person whose own natural abilities mean that he can just enforce this all on its own. That's why Hobbes talks not just about natural abilities, but kind of these other abilities, not just natural skill, which is strength and cunning, and natural resources, which are human resources, which again are things like strength and cunning and reflexes and speed, and kind of analytical power. But also there's going to be kind of social resources and social skill, which is things like the ability to persuade, charm, the kind of the networks and influence you have with powerful families and with powerful members of society. Obviously, a sovereign needs those things. And so if a sovereign can essentially use, and I'll use this term from American government, can use their political capital in an effective way to essentially have that army, have that law enforcement, have that kind of structure to enforce his rules, then he is doing his job. But if the sovereign is so capricious, so mercurial, so kind of inconsistent, that he destroys the political capital that allows him to have the army and the network of kind of elites and military, economic, and political elites necessary to enforce his rules, then he is an incompetent sovereign and has lost his legitimacy.
You okay there, Charlene?
Sorry, my phone started ringing.
Oh no.
Okay, so unless he's Chuck Norris, yes, I'm glad you guys engaged with that particular element.
Did I mention how Chuck Norris's particular brand of politics is very American-centric, and he would also deny the Leviathan as communist propaganda or something?
That's true. Chuck Norris, yes, absolutely. And Robert says common rules imposed from above seldom benefit the commoners. Yep, you're right, they seldom do. But even so, common rules that benefit elites over commoners still benefit commoners, according to Hobbes, because they're better than the chaos of the state of nature. And they're certainly better. Having a king sovereign over all of Britain is definitely better than having warlord chieftains riding across your land all the time, demanding you swear fealty to them, and if you swore fealty to the others, they murder your children and rape your wives because you swore fealty to the wrong person at the wrong time. It's much better to have one king who's not trampling over your land all the time because he has the power to stop the warlords and chieftains and nobles from demanding your fealty in multiple directions. The commoner lives a much better life under that circumstance, under even a tyrannical king, than under a weak king. And that's what Hobbes is really arguing here, is that the core thing is to have a strong sovereign. And so it's important to have a strong sovereign. That's much better than a weak sovereign, because a weak sovereign can't control the nobles the chieftains and the warlords from competing and from demanding your fealty. And that's the state of nature, where different men are using what power they have to be a law unto themselves, and there's no common law. There's no common rules. So, this is his argument. But again, it stems from fear. All right, I'm going to erase this portion, and we're going to go with Locke. So, yeah, here we go. All right, does that help understand and sum up Hobbes?
Yes.
Okay, Locke is going to be similar, except that Locke is not going to kind of focus on fear. He's not going to focus on fear as the primary motivator. Hobbes is going to have a lot more faith in human reason. Locke is going to have a lot more faith in human reason. And so whereas Hobbes believed that the state of nature would be governed by fear and selfishness and the pursuit of power over others, Locke is going to believe that the state of nature is going to be governed by reason and by essentially Christianity. Yeah, yes, you're right. So, and that's a good way to think of it. That's another reason why Hobbes probably pisses off Americans, because we know in the Revolution of the American Revolution, Hobbes would probably not, assuming he was consistent in his philosophy, Hobbes would not be on the side of the American revolutionaries. So, Locke, and we are now definitely in Locke, so Locke is similar to Hobbes in that he believed that government gains its legitimacy only through the consent of the governed, and that before government existed, or before, I shouldn't say before government existed, that's kind of a bad way to put it. In the absence of government is that humans, or man, is both individual and free. So that essentially the most important unit of the philosophy is the individual. That's very much different than the Christians and the Greeks, where the most important unit was the community. In other words, to the Christians and the Greeks, the community, otherwise known as the polis, was greater than the individual. And that doesn't even put it as best as I should. Because to the Greeks and the Christians, the individual was really not a concept that they would kind of find meaningful in the discussion of politics. Because individuals, to them, people, you people, us people, only gain our meaning, only gain our significance in relationships. So they wouldn't even, to the Greeks and the Christians, it wasn't even, they didn't focus on the individual, they focused on relationships. You only derive meaning, you only are valid in terms of the human race because of the network of relationships, of cooperations that you were born into. Hence, Aristotle, and Plato, Aristotle, and the Christians kind of look at it as the family, the town, and then the polis, is that it's just, they only focus on these units of relationship, the familial unit of relationship, the neighborhood unit of relationship, and then the political or the city unit of relationship. That's all that mattered to them. They didn't really conceive of human beings as sovereign individuals. Whereas Hobbes is the first one that we study who's going to write about the human as a sovereign individual. As write about human beings as sovereign individuals, each a law unto themselves. Locke is also going to look at this as sovereign individuals. So what changes? Well, I speculate, and this is my speculation. You're right, okay. Key point, that's a good point, this is a very brief point, is that Augustine and Aquinas were Catholic Christians. They come from organic Catholic Christianity, okay? Whereas Locke, when I say Christianity, it's definitely Protestant or Reformation Christianity that we're talking about. And of course, Protestant Reformation Christianity has a much more fond relationship with the individual than Catholic Christianity. Because in this case, Locke is not just English, which is Protestant, but Locke comes from a family of Puritan sympathizers. So this is not just even English Protestantism, which is Anglican, which is essentially just kind of like the English version of the Catholic Church. But it is Puritan, which means the reformers, the bottom-up reformers, the Calvinists. And they have a much kind of more fond relationship with this concept of individual. So, starting with Hobbes, I mean, really actually starting with Machiavelli, who really focuses on the prince as an individual. But starting with Hobbes, Hobbes is in the social contract philosophers. The whole point of the state of nature is to kind of philosophically orient politics around man as an individual. That's the whole point of the state of nature construction hypothesis. What would the human look like outside of community? Well, he would look like a free and sovereign individual. And so because of that, let's kind of justify politics, let's justify government, let's justify the state by starting from the position of man as a sovereign individual. Whereas the Greeks and the Christians, they didn't have to do that because they didn't feel the need to justify politics, to justify government, to justify the state, because to them, the state was a given. The state was the natural position of man. As man didn't exist as an individual, he only existed as a group. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Right, not the state, the community, right? Obviously, we're talking about the state here, but whether we talk about the state is in terms of the nation state or the city state, then we're still looking at it in that direction. So, in this sense, the individual is free. Now, Hobbes takes this and says the individual is free, and the individual is too free. Hobbes looks at this and says, whoa, you're too free, because your freedom is going to lead you to seek power, to use your freedom, to exercise your freedom over other people. In other words, your freedom is going to lead to the pursuit of domination over others. But Locke doesn't believe so. Locke doesn't believe so, because Locke earnestly believes, that human freedom, that the individual freedom is going to be tempered, is that there won't be so much too free. it won't be chaos. It won't be nasty, brutish, and short. Why not? Because Locke believes, or actually has an adherence to Christian kind of concept of natural law. In other words, that he believes that God's law restrains man.
Matt Jones.
This is what we're. One second, Elvis, and then I'll let you speak. So this is what we're going to focus the rest of today trying to understand, is this key distinction between Locke and Hobbes, is that God's law restrains man. Go ahead, Elvis.
Well, I don't know. The way I interpreted it could be interpreted, not that it should be, but it could be interpreted without the need for Christianity, because, well, I mean, he's saying that God gave us the earth to build upon it for our convenience, to become comfortable. And I mean, it's natural to reason out. Anybody can reason out or even observe in the various situations of the world that in a hard time like the state of nature, people say we're all in this together, and people band together in hard times in the pursuit, in the state of nature, in the pursuit of property.
High School Musical taught us that.
Yeah.
No, I get what you're saying. He obviously Locke uses a very Christian concept, a Protestant Christian concept of moral law, that there's a moral law governing. But to a certain extent, modern secularism kind of, its primary goal of neo-atheism and modern secularism is to kind of identify that there's moral restraint upon human beings, even if there is no God. So ultimately, we can kind of just take a look and say that, Locke doesn't have to be grounded directly in biblical kind of the biblical divine for this to work. As long as you believe in, as long as you kind of accept the authority of some fashion of a moral law, even if that moral law is, one of logic and reason and kind of the natural state of the universe, then moral law will still govern. And basically what he means is this. So, that in the state of nature, we all still have, we don't lose our moral sense. So in other words, and this is what I wanted to get to, the most important distinction, hold on just a second, let me say it this way. The most important distinction between Hobbes and Locke is that Hobbes does not believe that there's any common definition of morality. Locke does. Hobbes does not believe there's any common understanding of morality, that you'll define good your way, I'll define good my way, based off of our respective time and space positions in the plenum. Locke does believe that there is a common understanding.
See, I have a question. I'm confused about that now, because the way I read it is he was actually in agreement with Hobbes that the law of nature is about self-preservation. It's just that he was different from Hobbes in his conclusion from that the law of nature and humans' natural will to preserve themselves leads them to cooperate with one another and basically adopt Christian virtues for the purpose of preserving themselves and working out of the state of nature. And that comes from self-preservation, which is self-interest, but simultaneously is ordained by God.
Not necessarily. Okay, so we might be might be taking parallel lines, but on similar tracks. So let me see if we can clarify this. So to Hobbes, it is self-preservation. It is more like selfish self-preservation. And the natural law, the laws of nature that Hobbes brings out are the laws of self-preservation, which is why the only right that you cannot give up in the social contract is the right to self-preservation. As a matter of fact, it is the first law of nature, is that all men, all people have a right to preservation, have a right to try and protect their life. But Locke is a little different. So, and maybe we can start this by turning to page 366. Are you guys on page 366?
Yes.
Okay. You see point 6 there, the paragraph that starts with the 6?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's read that. Let's start reading that paragraph, and we'll see if this kind of clarify with what Elvis was talking about. But though this be a state of liberty, the state of nature, individual freedom, yet it is not a state of license. So he's going to establish the difference between license and liberty. Though man and the state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And the reason, which is that law, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and dependent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Now here's the key. For men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all servants of one master, sent into the world by his order and about his business. They are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not another's pleasure, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy another, as if we were made for another's uses, as the inferior rank of creatures of ours. So this is the distinction. So that equality that happens, that freedom and equality, and individuals in the state of nature are free and they are equal. But in Hobbes, we are free and equal, but in this kind of state of fear and preservation, where all of us are trying to survive and view everybody else as a threat. And therefore, that's the equality. Whereas, we're all equal in the sense that we all have equal claim to define morality the way we want to. That's the equality in Hobbes. Hobbes says that human beings are equal because they define morality based off of their own selfish interest. That's the equality that Hobbes sees in the state of nature. But Locke sees, no, there's an equality that's ordained from on high. In other words, that human beings, I got space over here, that humans beings, so you, me, the other guy, etc., all of us are underneath God. We all are equal in the sense that we are all equally workmanship of God, and we all are equally owned by God. So since we are owned by God, we are not owned by each other. But since there is a common source of equality, then there is a common understanding of morality. Because if we are all subject to God, then God's law is over all of us. In Hobbes, if there isn't a human sovereign, there is no common law. With Locke, even in the absence of a human sovereign, there is still a common law, God's moral law. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It seems almost as if reason and God's law is inextricably intertwined with self-interest and preservation. But, so.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that a little bit. So let's take, for example, and this is kind of the examples that I use in American government all the time, which is, and it's similar to, kind of Thomas Aquinas and his natural law. If we have reason, then we can, if we use our reason and apply our reason, in other words, if we use our heads instead of our appetites, if we use our heads and our minds instead of our appetites, we can reason out that it's probably best to restrain our vices, to restrain our desires, and to restrain our freedom or our license, so that others will also restrain, so that we do not signal to others, but that we realize that that if we live around other human beings, there is some natural kind of rules that happen that we can reason out. And that's why Locke says the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law. So this is similar to Thomas Aquinas. God laid out these kind of natural laws, including a moral law, and we have the ability through reason to understand that moral law well enough so that we are held accountable for violating it. Let me put it this way, and this is in support of what you're saying, I think, Elvis. Does there have to be a law in place to tell us that it is wrong to push nice old ladies down the stairs?
No.
Well, in Denmark's case.
No, that's inhumane. There's lethal cocktails to be injected into nice old ladies in their case. So, at any rate, right? If does there have to be a law in place, or is it wrong to push nice old ladies down the stairs either way?
It's wrong. Even without the government telling me it's wrong.
You're right. Now, mean old ladies, they're fair game. But nice old ladies, that you shouldn't, they're the ones you shouldn't push down the stairs. No, obviously, there is certain common elements. Is it, for instance, even in the state of nature, quote unquote state of nature, or even without a sovereign law governing us, would it still be such a situation where you would, if you witnessed this, you would still be able to think it wrong if one man stole the child of another man, or one woman stole the child of another woman because they couldn't have children of their own? They said, well, we can't have children, so we're going to take yours, and he or she is ours now. Would we need a law to say, no, that's probably a bad idea, and it's probably better for human cooperation, and reason dictates, logic can reveal that it's better for human cooperation, and it's better for everybody in the long term if I protect your child from kidnappers? Yeah. In other words, that we have a common understanding of rights that allows us to defend and respect each other's rights. Therefore, it restrains our freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, yeah, it's, as long as there's this kind of concept of a common understanding of a moral law or a moral set of rules that obligates us to respect the rights or the property of others, the families and property of others, and obligates us to protect the rights and property of others, the families and properties of others, from invasion, then Hobbes' state of nature is really not a threat anymore. I think Charlene has it not on push to talk, but just on when she talks, it goes forward. So this is the huge distinction. Moral law restrains man. Therefore, the state of nature isn't nasty, brutish, and short. The state of nature isn't the war of all against all. The state of nature is a state of basic freedom. It's not absolute uncertainty because there is a common understanding. Hobbes doesn't believe so. According to Locke, in the passage we just read on page 366, paragraph 6, even without a sovereign, man is not a law, no individual is a law unto themselves. Reason and morality, reason and Christianity, essentially, in Locke's conception. Reason and Christianity dictate that there is a law, that no man's a law unto themselves, because all are under the sovereignty of God, regardless of whether the state, the government, or society exists. And that restrains them. And therefore, there is a difference between license and freedom. License.
The conference is about to end.
License is when you make choices that violate reason and morality simply to appease your own appetites. License is theft. License is robbery. License is sexual assault or rape. License includes things like, for instance, not just those key things, but license also includes things like fraud. License includes things like using other people as profit margins, not as social members of the same community. So that's license. Freedom is your ability to make choices within the framework of moral law, with remaining a subject of moral law. That's freedom, not license. Locke says that in the state of nature, humans are individuals with freedom, but that still doesn't justify license. License still has consequences, even if there's no sovereign to enforce the consequences. Because if we are in this kind of natural state together, and I can't have children of my own, and I go and steal your children, or I take your property, or I try and run off with your wife, then you guys will band together. There's a good chance you guys will band together to stop me from doing that so that you can protect yourselves. So my license still has consequences to it, even if there's no sovereign to punish them. I know, the Zoom sovereign is the most absolute leviathan that we have right now. So I actually asked to reschedule the sessions so that we have 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after, so that it doesn't just kind of do that. But we can't do that right now. We've actually lost a key member of the Office of Instruction. She got a better job because she was incredibly awesome, and we should have paid her more so that she kept her job, but we lost her, and so now we essentially we are behind the 8 ball on being able to deal with these things. At any rate, Are there any questions about Hobbes and Locke and the distinctions between Hobbes and Locke's state of nature before the conference ends?
Nope.
Nope.
You guys feel pretty like you understand it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Locke's a far more natural fit to, most people, in my opinion.
Yes. So we've got a minute left, and I'm just going to say, one of the commonalities between them that we're going to talk about on Thursday is that both Hobbes and Locke, the government or the state or politics has to justify its authority by saying why it's better than the state of nature. Now, that's an easy justification in Hobbes. It's a harder justification with Locke because the state of nature isn't the war of all against all. So we're going to pick it up with how the state legitimizes itself or how politics legitimizes itself through the social contract on Thursday. I will see you guys later.
See you later.
Yeah.